Not so long ago, I found an essay of yours. I don't remember quite how I found it, but I found an essay of yours called In a Land Far Away, about a trip you took to North Korea. And I thought it was beautifully written essay. And so I'm eager to hear your to hear your thoughts and to hear your memories about the trip to North Korea. When did you go to North Korea?
It was in the spring of 2002,
Spring of 2002. And
19 years ago.
and how long were you there?
I don't know for sure, but it was around a week, I think, give or take.
Around a week. And what time of year?
Well, judging from the one photograph I have of me there when there were flowers in the rice paddies, I think springtime.
Okay, all right. And why did you go?
Well, there are many reasons. The Department of Defense was going on a recovery mission, and they invited me to go. And it's always been the land far away from me. It's where my father was lost. He went down there, and I only had kind of nightmarish visions of what it might be like. And so it was bringing me closer to him.
Yeah. So you said recovery mission, and then you said your father was lost. Link those two things for us. Spell that out. What you mean there?
Okay, my dad was recalled to the Air Force in '51, and went over to North Korea, and in January of '52, on a night mission, they went down, and he was never seen nor heard from again. The other three crew members were accounted for. Two made it and one did not. The two who did were POWs until the end of the war, but my dad just disappeared. So it's been a mystery ever since.
Your dad was in the Air Force?
Yes.
Right. And so in January 1951, his plane went down.
52.
I'm sorry, 52. That's right. January 52. Do you know why the plane went down? Is that information even available? The reason the plane went down?
Well, I wasn't even born when they went down. I was born 2 months later, and so I was a young child in the ensuing years. But once I got old enough to want to know more, I reached out to the two crew members who had been returned, and I spoke with both of them at length. I met them, actually. Wow. And they told me what happened, as to the best of their knowledge, that night. John Quinn was the pilot, and he doesn't think that they got hit by flak. He's not sure, but the left engine stopped. And then the next thing you knew, the right engine stopped, and he wasn't sure if he had forgotten to switch it over, switch the fuel tanks over, or what. They just don't know, but they had to bail.
Wow. So even the two survivors that you're able to talk to, they're not even sure whether it was a plane malfunction or whether the malfunction came as a result of flak from the ground.
They had just finished their bombing mission, and they were out over the Yellow Sea on their way back when the engine stopped. So John had to turn inland so that they could bail over land and not the ocean. It was the middle of the night. And my dad was operating Sharan in the back of the plane. It's a separate compartment that's separated by the bomb bay. So if he got out, a different hatch, and it was nighttime, like I said, so they just never saw or heard from him again, and they were captured.
Wow. The second part of that question was, you used the word recovery. I want to come back to that. But you mentioned that these other two were captured and taken prisoner. Have you, in your discussions with them, did you hear anything from them about what their experience was like being prisoners of war in North Korea?
Yes, they were tortured into germ warfare confessions. They became quite celebrated as POWs. The Chinese broadcast their confessions, and they were picked up by communist media, newspapers, and written about and stuff. They were made to go around the POW camp and tell the other prisoners that they had dropped germ-laden bombs and things like that. But as with most Air Force officers, they were, for the most part, kept separate from the general POW population.
Wow. Again, this is off the trail a little bit, and so I won't press this too far. But in your discussion with them, so you said they were tortured into making these confessions about what it was germ warfare that they were forced into making these confessions, which I know was happening quite a bit. In your discussions with these two, as they're talking about that, did they reflect on that? I mean, did they ever comment on that, reflecting back on the confessions that they made? If that,
You mean how they felt about having made?
yeah, I mean, how they felt about having done that. And I don't mean this in any way to criticize, but just to kind of, I'd just be interested in hearing them reflecting back on well, I was just going to say on the decision to do that, but if you're being tortured into doing something, I'm not sure we can really talk about somebody making a decision to do something, but.
Right. And I would never pass judgment on them, of course. And I did not ask them. They did not bring it up. There was some vague, I have some vague recollection of speaking with Ken Enoch, who was the navigator, and about all of it. And he just said kind of, snidely, but in a nice way, he said, just look at the picture. And the picture of him when he was supposedly making the confession, he's sitting there with a big smile on his face, a cigarette in his hand, and looks like he's just having the time of his life. And of course, everybody knew that wasn't the case. Anybody. So in other words, it was his way of telling me that the whole thing had been staged.
Right. Wow. Now, you say in your essay that these two, Ken Enoch and John Quinn, that there are photos of them in a museum in Pyongyang. Is that right?
Well, there were, when I was there, I don't know if the exhibit has been changed, but we, as part of our mission, our tour, we were taken by a tour guide through the museum, the National Museum in Pyongyang, and we were taken into the atrocities room. That's what they called it. It was a huge vaulted ceiling room. And yes, on one entire wall, it was devoted to John Quinn and Ken Enoch and their germ warfare confessions and all about my dad's, their mission, not mentioning my dad, of course. But I was most uncomfortable because I didn't know if they knew that was my dad's mission. And, you always worry from what you hear about being detained, wow. I should say. But if nothing like that ever happened, and they never, ever confronted me or acted as though they knew the connection. But it was interesting because on the wall you had John and Ken, and the picture I mentioned to you, and it was like a kindergartner had drawn pictures of bombs with little bugs crawling out of it and everything. So clearly not what germ warfare would have been like. I think that it was yet another way that they were trying to make the statement that they were not telling the truth and they were being forced to do what they were doing.
Oh, these were drawings from one or both of them.
Correct.
Oh, wow. Now you mentioned that we're going to get back to the recovery thing, but you to that word, but you said that you were worried when you were in the museum, because you were worried that they would find out that you were related to someone else who had been on that same plane, and then you were worried that you might be detained or something there in North.
Well, I think maybe I used the word worried, but I think that might be a little bit strong. It crossed my mind. I felt a little uncomfortable. Let's just put it that way, because I didn't know enough about the regime. I mean, I was there with the Department of Defense on a mission, so it would be quite unlikely that they would have ever done anything like that. But I did feel uncomfortable. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, sure. So there's no way to convey to someone who wasn't there and who didn't bring to that moment everything that you brought to it. But well, first of all, when you went to the museum, did you know that this exhibit was going to be there?
No, it was a total surprise. And I found it kind of interesting that they just happened to bring us there. And it might have been not so subtle way of telling me that they knew. On the other hand, we were a delegation of Americans, and this was their statement about the evil Americans, the imperialist Americans, as they referred to us more than once while we were there, and the terrible things we have done. So it might have had nothing to do with me whatsoever. But it was interesting that they, brought us to this room, this atrocities room, and there we are, highlighted as the bad guys.
What words would you use to describe your first reaction? I just have in my mind, the image of somebody walking into a room and anticipating, something, but then instantly being confronted with something that not only is unanticipated, that specific thing is unanticipated, but that specific thing has so much to do with something that's of such central importance to you. There's no way to get that across to someone who hasn't experienced it, but what words would you use to describe your reaction or, how that first struck you?
There were a lot of reactions. One, of course, was surprise. I was taken aback. Then there was the discomfort that I mentioned. Also, of course, it wasn't just that I was standing there looking up at Ken and John, but we had a tour guide who was delivering what sounded like a prepared speech, one that they might often deliver, and like another one that we were given en route to one of the crash site, the recovery sites in the helicopter. But it was I would call it a spiel, and it was very anti-American, again referring to us as the imperialist Americans, and so it was whoa, we're the enemy here. They really hate us. Do they really believe all this? Or is it just rhetoric that is fed to people and they're obligated to recite it? You couple that with being confronted face to face, so to speak, with my father's crew members and being drawn near in my heart back to that time, that night, that night that it had to be horrific, and I don't know for sure what happened. So many, many emotions.
Wow. So it's interesting because, you're mentioning, you use the word spiel, and, that's something I want to return to later, but, you've kind of indicated this is, this is kind of a, for lack of a better word, kind of a weird situation that, you've come to another country and you're kind of being confronted, rather pointedly, in this way. But one of the things that struck me about your essay is that that's not the only thing you have to say, that there are other things that happen in North Korea that make the picture a little more complicated. We'll come back to that, but let's now come to that word recovery. You said right at the outset that you had been invited to North Korea as part of work related to a recovery. What does that refer to?
In the accounting effort, we refer to them as the JROs, the Joint Recovery Operations. And in 2002, they were still ongoing between the United States and the DPRK. They were military to military operations. In other words, the KPA, the Korean People's Army, and members of the U.S. military worked together side by side to recover, excavate really graves and remains that had been discovered. And this particular, we went to two when I was there. One was at the Chosin Reservoir, which is up in the northeast, and then Unsan, which is in the northwestern section of the country. And so when I say a recovery, it was a recovery of a set of remains.
Wow. How many recovery sites did you go to?
Just the two.
You went to the two. I want to ask you, so I want to come back and ask you about, what you saw at these recovery sites. But you said something a minute ago that's, pretty striking. And I think a lot of Americans who pay attention, who have a general idea of U.S.-North Korean relations, something that they would notice. I think you said U.S. military personnel, and did you say North Korean military personnel as well?
Yes, the KPA.
were working together at these sites?
Yes.
Maybe this will sound like a dumb question, but what did that look like? What did you actually see them doing?
Um, they were different. At Chosen, the work had already been done. They had unearthed a grave of some Army, U.S. Army, who had gone out on a patrol down a side road and unwittingly stumbled upon, I don't know if it's a patrol or a battalion, I don't know the size, but a Chinese encampment. And rather than take them and turn them over as POWs, they just killed them and threw them in a hole, literally threw them in a hole. You could tell by the way the remains were laying that they hadn't been laid there. They had been thrown in and dirt had been dumped over them. But at the point that we got there, the grave had been unearthed down to expose about the top inch or two of the layer of the skeleton brushed off. And so it was quite moving in a horrific way because man was just laying there. But so we didn't see them actually working, other than there was a grave next to it that they were starting to unearth. And so there was some minimal amount of work going on while we were there in that regard. The other one in Unsan was entirely different. And this was much more side by side working together. They had in that location, for whatever reason, there were not full skeletons. There were bone chips and teeth and things like that in the soil. And so they had a canopy set up with different sifters, and they were sifting through soil looking for small particles, artifacts, as well as parts of remains.
Wow.
And they were literally standing next to each other or across from each other in a given screen. They spoke some English. Our guys didn't really speak Korean. And so most of the conversation was in English, either via translator or the actual member of the KPA.
Wow. So what you're describing, usually when the news gets through to typical Americans who are just looking at their news feeds about, Sergeant so-and-so's remains have been recovered.
Mm-hmm.
And, we can say this now with certainty. What you're looking at is the beginning of that process, right, of remains actually being found.
Yes. And
So,
we have different sets of remains. We have hundreds of them in the Punch Bowl in Hawaii that were returned at the end of the war, but they couldn't be identified because formaldehyde had been put on the remains to preserve them during transit, and that
right.
found the DNA. That's a whole separate thing. But essentially, most of the remains are in North Korea, and yes, have to be disinterred, or if they already have been, they have some that are above ground already. That they have returned some, and hopefully they will return others in the future.
Do you know roughly how many are still unaccounted for? How many U.S. service members are still unaccounted for from the Korean War?
Yes, just over 7,500.
And your dad being one of them.
Yes.
Yeah.
And of those, about 5,000 are presumed to be in North Korea. There are some in South Korea. We don't know how many were taken to the Soviet Union or China. And then, like I said, we have, I think, about 700 now at the Punch Bowl in Hawaii.
And, marked as unknown.
Yes, except with the advent of new technologies, they are now able to extract DNA more and identify those. We have chest X-rays from them, and they have learned that the collarbones are unique, to each individual. So that's a means other than just DNA. And so in 7 stages, they're unearthing them and putting them through the rigors of the identification process. So that's a real good step forward.
I want to come back to this recovery site where you said there was some interaction. Because as we've been talking now, I'm hearing, I don't know, 2 different stories. I don't think that's right, but I'm hearing something that I'm interested in hearing you reflect on. And so you're in the museum, and you're hearing some pretty hard-hitting stuff that, on its face, doesn't seem very friendly. You mentioned in your essay you're on a helicopter. Is it a helicopter? I think it's a helicopter.
Yes.
And the person on the helicopter delivers a speech that can be, I think, interpreted as not very friendly. But then on the ground, you say that we've got, at this, this is something that really sticks in my mind, and maybe it shouldn't, but it really stands out to me. And that is that you say we've got American military and Korean military, at least in close proximity to one another, working. So to me, that seems like, well, that's maybe a little bit of a surprise that we've got these, not just North Koreans and Americans working close together, because you've got NGOs who are doing that, U.S. NGOs and non-government organizations and so on, but American military and North Korean military working side by side. Do you think that, it makes sense to be a little surprised by that, or what's your own, as you reflect on what you saw there, what's your own thinking about that?
Well, I think it's natural to think that because of the hostilities that have been perpetuated between our two countries. In fact, we are still at war. We haven't ended the war, and all the rhetoric that goes on. But I was struck by, once I got in there, that dissipated for me. Big bad North Korea that took my dad, that I had hated my whole life. Not a good thing to say about them. I got in there, and starting with the physical beauty, I pictured it the frozen middle of the night winter tundra. That's how it was when my dad went down. This was beautiful, spring, thatched roof, homes in the distant farms, flowers everywhere. And all of a sudden, these men standing side by side, they weren't in uniforms with guns on their hips. They were in shorts and, just casual digging in the dirt clothes. And they had a job to do, and they were doing it. And it was a connection, a human connection. And so, yes, technically they were military, but it wasn't part of military duty, really, that they were perceiving as they were there.
Okay, so I should not have in my mind then the image of, when I say military personnel, then they're not actually in military uniform. They're in sort of civilian work clothes, or digging in the dirt, doing this work. You used the word human a minute ago, and this is something that comes through in your essay. Kind of the complicated situation you described before going to the DPRK. Kind of this assumption of you didn't use this word, but sort of an assumption of hostility or something like that. And you did hear those words. I want to come back to what you were saying a few minutes ago. You said, you heard these very anti-American statements, and you saw the display in the museum. You used the word spiel. Does that mean that the words, if you read the words, I imagine they're going to come across as very hostile. When the words were being said, did it feel hostile?
It seemed, first of all, that they had been fed these diatribes, if you will. And to me, that's the difference. There's the regime and the hostility that it projects outwardly, and probably insists on its representatives conveying. It could be that they have been fed so much misinformation, in my view, about the United States, about us as people, that they really feel that. They believe that because they don't have the connections with the outside world to filter. But yes, the flight attendant on the helicopter in particular seemed very angry. And she just had a small helicopter full of Americans, and she was going on and on about all the bad things that we are and that we do. The tour guide in the museum was more plastic, more robotic, just delivering something that, to me, it seemed she had been told to say.
So it sounds like, a follow-up question that I had in mind was, if you had a chance to sit down with either of these two folks over a cup of coffee or tea with a translator, how do you think it would go? And yeah, I don't know if you have any response to that. It sounds like maybe with the person on the helicopter, it probably wouldn't go very well.
I have no idea because, again, I don't know if they are being told they must or if they truly believe it.
What all this is leading up to, in my own mind, having read your essay, is I think an especially, lovely section of a very nice essay where you talk about this episode with a Korean War veteran from North Korea, right? A North Korean, or the son. I'm sorry, the son of a Korean War veteran. Tell us that story.
It was a function, an evening, and we were all around a table, and I was seated next to a gentleman who was in uniform. He was serving. We were both in about the same age, and his father had served in the Korean War too. And our conversation started out pretty, pro forma and formal, but all around the table, it was too big for us all to have a general conversation, so people started dissolving into their own. And as he and I did into ours, we became more people, not a delegate from the United States and a member of the Korean People's Army. And he told me his father had been lost in the war as well. And strangely, I guess not so, but it struck me as strange, he was MIA too. This young man never knew what happened to his own father in their own country. So he had lived the same experience that I had lived. And we both had hated each other's country and by, shall we say, extension, each other for our whole lives. Wow. And here we had this opportunity to talk. By the end, we were crying together. I saw him as a person, he saw me as a person, and it was a really good ambassadorship, I think, for each of us to realize that, countries go to war, people suffer the effects of war. And I realized that the North Koreans are people too. And it was a really rewarding experience for me.
Gosh. Literally, I don't mean this as a figure of speech. Literally, a chill went up my spine hearing that story. I just think that there's something really important in this, and on the one hand, it's kind of a lesson for sixth graders that if you can actually sit down and talk to people, often you'll find that a lot of the assumptions we have are mistaken or reality is more complicated. But I mean, it's a really powerful image of you're sitting down with the son of a North Korean War veteran. It turns out that both of you have fathers missing from the war.
The one thing he said to me that I remember, and this is a paraphrasing, of course, but he said, "Did you always dream about him coming home?"
Wow.
My version of that is I always expected him to show up at the door. And wow. I think that's when we started crying.
That's really beautiful. I mean, that's a really beautiful thing. I imagine you can remember what he looked like.
Yes, I can.
Yeah. So put all of this together, then you have this really amazing array of experiences in a pretty short time. I noticed when you talked about the finding the remains at Chosin, at some point, you even kind of made a gesture that indicated that, you remember what the skeleton looked like in the ground. Is that right?
Its position.
The position of the skeleton.
The full skeleton. So it looked like, the remains of a man, not a bone here and a bone there.
Right. I mean, that by itself would be a powerful lifelong memory. You've got all of these things packed into, roughly a week or something like that. You're hearing some, rough talk on the helicopter. You're hearing rough talk in the museum. You see these Americans and North Koreans working, collaborating there at is it Unsan, I think? And then you have this really powerful experience with this North Korean man. As you put all of this together and just kind of reflect back on that trip to North Korea. What sort of general thoughts do you have about it?
Well, juxtaposed with all of that is something else, and that is the fact of how different their society is. When we landed in the airport, there was no commercial anything there. There were no other airlines, no civilian, no people bustling about the airport, no food stands, nothing. Completely empty except for the military. And the other thing, so I mean, their civilization, their culture is so different. Pyongyang looks like a big capital city, but other than that, it's the streets that we saw, but no people on them. There were guard stations at the mouth of each neighborhood where they lived, and people wouldn't look at us. I don't know if it's because they had such disdain for us or they were told not to, but I would try to make eye contact and they would look away. So when you put it all together, when Kim Song-il took over, and I often want to, it's Kim Il-sung, I'm sorry, and began the authoritarian rule after World War II, it was on a doctrine of self-reliance. Or who knows if it's protective or if it's manipulative. But since then, there have been a total of 3 of them, all of them authoritarians, and they walled their country off. We on the outside think it's because they don't want influence taking place over their citizens so that they will doubt the authoritarian rule. I don't know, but after generations of living under it, it's a whole different society. You look in the windows of homes and they all had both of the 2 supreme leaders' portraits hanging in their living room. We don't all do that here. So yes, there's hostility between the countries. I think it's grown worse. The JROs were cut off in 2005, and we have yet to get back in there. And I think the rhetoric and the hostility has escalated. We're going to have to change our course if we're going to get back in. But I don't know why or it's always very complicated, and it's way above my pay grade, as they say, to understand the politics and what have you.
Right. So you're not a professional diplomat. You're not I'm assuming you're not a professional North Korea watcher and an analyst in this sort of thing. You have, I mean, on the one hand, North Korea has been on your mind for a very long time because of what happened with your father in January 1952. But you spend a relatively short period there, and so your experience is limited. So I'm just asking for your own views, right? Just your own impression. You said that the recovery missions were stopped in 2005, and your impression is that relations between North Korea and the United States have gotten worse since then. Is it your feeling, and that's really all I'm asking about, is just your own impression, your own sense. Is it your own feeling, is it your sense that these kinds of missions that you've described, that they can be helpful, when it comes to bigger questions of relationship between the United States and North Korea?
Yes, I do a lot of work on the Hill and with policy and diplomacy and this, the executive branch. We have a number of initiatives that we are pursuing, excuse me, at this time. The problem is we have the travel ban and sanctions imposed to punish North Korea for its nuclear program. And so we're just butting heads and nothing is happening. If we could get the travel ban and the sanctions lifted insofar as NGO, non-government organizations work is concerned, then we can go in, bring humanitarian aid, medical aid. We need to get teams in there to travel around to the crash sites and see what the villagers, the locals know about graves in the area. There's a lot of give and take that could help on a humanitarian level, both our mission and the North Korean people. But it could also, I think, be a backdoor way of breaking down this harsh rhetoric, the the anger and the posturing that goes on between us. And, it's not Congress in particular, but this country in general likes to treat North Korea like it's the devil incarnate. And they pro sanctions all the way. They won't delink or haven't yet delinked these humanitarian issues from the politics. And so it puts up a bar. North Korea plays its part too. There's a lot of, chest thumping and putting themselves out there like they're a threat to the rest of the world. If we could just lower the dialogue, and just, again, treat each other like people. So I think in more direct answer to your question, yes, diplomacy, what we refer to as track 2 discussions or diplomacy, and it's non-official. It's ambassadors, the United Nations, the North Korea mission in New York, going through those avenues, trying to open dialogue that is less angry. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. As I was just listening to you, it was striking to me, because your dad went missing either, over or in North Korea, and you don't even know have basic information about that. And yet you're advocating, seeing the North Koreans as people, and you're advocating, use the word, bringing humanitarian assistance, and that, that's impressive. Is this trip that you took, is that what is kind of behind the thinking that you have? I guess I'm thinking especially of this interaction with the son of the North Korean war veteran. Was that event kind of a turning point for you in thinking about this kind of thing?
Yes, for me personally, it was. I seeing the country itself, meeting some people, and there was no adversity or hostility other than those two spiels, as I referred to them.
Yeah.
They were very open and friendly. And when we were driving to Unsan, they pulled over the whole caravan and got me out and said, "This is where your father's plane went down," and gave me a few moments by myself, took a picture of me, let me pick some flowers and just gather up some earth and put in a little vial. These were tender moments. When countries are at war, everything's different. And, they have to turn the soldiers, the airmen, the servicemen and women now have to turn off their humanitarian components. They're at war. They're out there to kill each other. It's a terrible, terrible thing. And I understand that now more so after having seen them as people, not marching around, wanting to kill Americans.
I just have one last question for you. And it has to do with actually the very first sentence in your essay, In a Land Far Away. And the essay begins this way: "My father was lost but never found in the Korean War. Missing is quite different than killed." I could write a whole piece on that alone. And if you haven't already, I'd like to read it. Or if you have already, I'd like to read it. If you haven't, I hope you will. But here's the sentence I want to focus on. "For now, let me just say I have a shadow that follows me." All right. So again, this is one of those questions that I understand, I know going into it, is unanswerable, in that it's not possible to convey to someone who hasn't experienced it what it's like. But to the extent that, the English language makes it possible, how would you describe that to someone who's never experienced it? We go to the post office as of fairly recently. President Trump said that at the post office and other places that the POW MIA flag should now fly all the time. And so at the post office here in my town, the American flag, and then right underneath it is the prisoner of war missing in action flag. We see that, Americans see that flag all the time, but very, very few of us have the slightest idea of what it would be like to be where you are. You're born into a world where your dad had just gone missing, and that's something that's with you for your whole life. And so you refer to it as a shadow. To the extent possible, how would you describe that to someone who really wants to at least try to have a sense of that?
Um, I used the analogy because when you think about it, if the sun is just casting on you a certain way and you have a shadow, it is attached to you, and everywhere you go, the shadow goes with you. You can't. You are one, and it's just it's a reflection of you standing there. And when as I mentioned, I wasn't born yet, but my mom did a really good job of keeping our dad alive for me and my brother because he was just missing. She expected him to come home when the confusion was fixed or whatever. And my brother was 3 when dad left, and so he had some abandonment type things. I never got to know my dad, so I had a different set of hardship, but collectively, we both kept waiting for him to come home. And so if somebody dies, if they're killed, it's horrible, but you start to heal. We could never heal because it was never over. As I mentioned earlier, I kept waiting for him to show up at the door. Um, I have an internal memo that within the White House that was saying back that it was costing too much money to keep these MIAs on the payroll. And so they were going to have to at some point declare them dead so they could stop paying the families their salaries. And that happened in February of 1954. So when they were presumptively, the PFDs, presumptive findings of death, when that happened, my mother, like a lot of the other wives, just said, okay, they have enough to know that he's gone and he's not going to come back. But we were too young to understand that, and she still kept him alive for us with pictures, his hockey mitt, his skates, letters, you name it. And so in my mind, my daddy was out there somewhere. And so like a shadow that goes with you everywhere you go, so has he, and the uncertainty of what happened to him. And it's something that is just a part of who I am. And I know it's true for my brother as well.
You say that when you were in North Korea, you felt like you connected in some sense with your dad.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I did. That was the crane. That was a really, really special and final moment to my trip. They put us in a state guest house, and it was on a river, and there were several beautiful white cranes there. And I was walking along it, and I was accompanied by one of our hosts, if you will, a member of the KPA. And he told me that the significance of the white crane is that it means to them eternal life. And then I went about the rest of my trip, and when we were leaving, we were in the plane and we were running down the runway. I looked out the window and there was a white crane flying along, keeping pace with us, right? I was on the left side of the plane, right to my left, and he was looking in. It was looking in at me. We made eye contact and held it, and then the plane lifted off and he turned to the left, and I remembered what the gentleman had said about eternal life. And to me, it felt like at that moment that it was my dad.